This is a talk I gave at the IGRS Spring Lecture on the 20th of March 2013, the IGRS being the Irish Genealogical Research Society. And the title is DNA Brick Wall Buster, and the question mark is there because DNA can certainly help us break through brick walls in our family tree research, but is not necessarily the answer to everything, and is certainly not a substitute for documentary research. So we all hit brick walls in our family trees, and this is my family tree. Fairly typical probably of an Irish family tree. Was me at the bottom, and then at the level of my 3 times great grandparents who were born all around about the 1800 mark, I have identified 12 of my 3 times great grandparents. I have 6 possible candidates for some of them, and then I have not identified 14 of my great grandparents. These represent brick walls in my own family tree research, and this is after exhausting the usual documentary resources such as family lore, letters, Bible, the 1901 and 1911 censuses, which are online, Griffith's valuation from the middle of the 1800s, and the subsequent cancelled books held at the valuation office, which have proved very, very useful in breaking down the brick walls of some of my family lines. And of course the civil registration records, the birth, marriages and deaths from 1865 onwards, and before that the church records, which if you are lucky they'll go back to about 1800 or so. There's also collaboration with other researchers by posting my family tree on Ancestry, Genes Reunited, MyHeritage and RootsWeb, for example. And then, of course, a variety of newspapers becoming available online, and these really help add the flesh to the bones of your family tree. And for those people living in Dublin, the Glasnevin cemetery records are absolutely fantastic. And then, of course, we have later records in the 1900s, such as the 1939 electoral roll. So, having exhausted all of these traditional documentary resources, one turns to DNA to see whether we can actually break through some of these brick walls. Now, taking a DNA test couldn't be easier. Now, you could either scrape your cheek or give a saliva sample, and this goes into a tube, which in turn goes into an envelope supplied by the testing company, and you post it off to the lab. Now in the lab, they look at your sample, take out the DNA, run it through their analyzer and produce the results, which they post on your unique web page with your password and username, so that it's all nicely protected. But not only do they do that, they compare your results with the results of everybody else in their database and come up with a list of matches, which in fact are your genetic cousins. And they post this list of your matches on your web page, and that allows you the possibility of contacting these individuals and collaborating with them. Hello, I see we're genetic cousins. Here's my family tree. Do you want to compare mine with yours and see where we might have a common ancestor? Now, the third thing that they do is that they can involve you with projects. And this is where, rather than collaborating with an individual, you're actually collaborating with a group of people. And there are a lot of projects available on the internet now, which I will tell you about during the course of this presentation. There are 3 types of DNA test. We have the Y-DNA test, which has a reach of approximately 338,000 years, and this allows us to go back along the direct male line because the Y chromosome is passed from father to son. So my Y chromosome I got from my father, he got it from his father, he from his father, father, all the way back along the direct male line, and currently this test has a reach of about 338,000 years. On the other side of the family tree, we have the mitochondrial DNA test, and this does exactly the same for the female line, the direct female line. And that goes back along mother, 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 and that's because mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to daughters and sons, but only the daughters pass it on to their offspring. So that's the mitochondrial DNA, and that has a reach of approximately 200,000 years. But of course, if we were to do the Y and the mitochondrial DNA test, we'd be missing out everybody in between. And this is rectified by the autosomal DNA test. And this looks at all of the chromosomes in the human cell. And it has a reach of about 7 generations, so much less than the Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA. And if you allow maybe 30 years per generation, this would take you back to about 200 years, 210 years prior to your date of birth. I was born in 1960, so my autosomal DNA test should take me back to a common ancestor who was born around about 1750 or so. Now, the autosomal DNA test has a probability of detecting 99% of first and second cousins, 90% of third cousins, 50% of fourth cousins, and only about 10% of fifth cousins. So as you go back in time, it becomes much less sensitive at picking up living cousins, well, distant cousins are associated with a common ancestor back in the back 200 years ago or so. So there are two approaches to DNA testing. Now, the first thing you can do is you could try a fishing trip. You just take the test and see what you catch. The second type of approach is answering a specific question, and it usually is along the line of, I'm sure we're related to that crowd. And in that sort of situation, you and someone else would need to take the test. Whereas if you're just doing a fishing trip, only you need to take the test. So if you want to answer a specific question, and in many cases, if you want to break down a brick wall, that will be what you want to do, then you will probably have to test yourself and one or several other people. Let's look at the Y-DNA test. And this goes back along the direct male line, and to illustrate the application of this test in practice, I'd like to talk to you about my own Spearin surname project, which is a project that I set up to trace the ancestry of one of my particular lines of my family tree. And I'm collaborating with several other people. We have a dedicated website, and we also have our family tree DNA results publicly posted on the family tree DNA website. Now, when I first started this research, I met a chap called Bob Spearing, who has been researching the Spearings for the last 15 years. And he told me this incredible tale about how himself and several of his collaborators, fellow Spearins or Spearings, had found extracts from the wills of two brothers in the early 1700s, Luke and Matthew Spearin. Now, from these wills, they were able to put together a family tree of these early Limerick Spearins. And these Spearins married into the Hartwell family, who were mayors of Limerick in the late 1600s, and they had been granted land in Limerick as a result of their services to Charles I in his wars against Oliver Cromwell. Now, not only had they married into the Spearin family, but their children were called Hartwell Spearin, Charles Hartwell Spearin, George Hartwell Spearin, and this unusual combination of surnames had perpetuated through the ages. So much so that 24 of the 236 branches of the Spearins that we have identified so far contain this unusual surname combination, Hartwell Spearin. And for those particular 24 branches, it's likely on the balance of probabilities that their branch directly links back to the early Limerick Spearins, where the combination of Hartwell and Spearin is thought to have originated. There's a scrap of evidence from Sir William Beetham, who was chief herald in the mid-1800s, and he spent decades poring over a lot of the records that have since gone up in smoke in the 1922 fire at the Public Record Office. But he used to make notes on the pedigrees and the wills that he read, and he linked these early Limerick Spearins to a family called Spearing in London in the 1600s, and these Spearings were goldsmiths, and they lived in Leadenhall Street, right beside St Andrew Undershaft and underneath the Gherkin. So I have lots of information about these people. I even have the floor plans of where they lived. There is also a subsequent link further back to Cambridge, where apparently in 1534 Henry VIII gave a royal decree allowing a certain Nicholas Spearing to become one of the first 3 printers of the Cambridge University Press. And this Nicholas Spearing came from a large family of Spearings from Flanders and the Low Countries who were heavily involved in the book trade. And this particular Nicholas Spearing was best friends with Erasmus, arguably Europe's greatest intellectual. Well, as soon as my dad heard this, he said, well, I'm definitely related to these people, but you're not. So, a fantastic story, but how true was this connection, and could we actually prove it? So we turned to genetics to try and help us find the answer. Now, of course, The immediate problem for me is that I'm not a Spearin, I'm a Gleason, and my direct male line goes back Gleason, 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 Gleason. So in order to get Y DNA from my Spearin ancestor, I had to go back to my great-great-great-grandfather, and I had to trace his tree forward to all of his descendants in order to find a descendant on a direct male line. So he agreed to do the DNA test. He was my father's third cousin, and the results showed that we in fact were all exact matches. So the first 5 people to do the test had exactly the same values for each of their markers. And on this particular slide you can see, imagine the Y chromosome lying on its side with all the markers along the top, these ones here, and underneath each of the markers you have a particular set of values, and these values are written across in rows for each person who has been tested. And any mutation or difference in the markers is indicated by a coloured box, this one here, and this particular mutation is only 1 point different from all of the other ones. So the initial testing of the group showed that all of the people who tested initially were exact or very close matches to each other, and this indicated that they all shared a common ancestor within a genealogical time frame, say in the last 1,000 years since the introduction of surnames. And more people were tested, and they matched either exactly or very closely. And this allowed us to say that all of the various Spearins and Spearings and Sperrins all around the world, from New Jersey to Dublin to Ontario to New South Wales, were all genetically linked together. They were genetic cousins, and they shared a common ancestor within the last several hundred years. Other people tested and they did not match this group. And there are 2 possibilities for this. The first possibility is that these in fact were non-paternity events. Now the term non-paternity event means that the line of descent of the Y DNA has been broken somewhere in the last few generations. It might be 1 generation ago, it might be 10 generations ago, but somewhere along the direct male line there has been an interruption in the onward transmission of the same Y DNA from father to son. And there are various reasons for this. It could be due to adoption, it could be due to the fact that the children took the mother's name rather than the father's name. There could be a legal name change. It could be that the husband assumed the surname of his wife because she was of higher social status. And that certainly occurred in the case of Oliver Cromwell. And of course there's illegitimacy as well, a very common cause of the Y DNA transmission being interrupted along the direct male line. And 2 of these 4 people who did not match the rest of the group, the main group, they looked back at their family tree and they found evidence that there was probably a non-paternity event, an illegitimacy, or the children adopting the surname of the mother within the last 3 to 4 generations. For the remaining 2 of the 4 people who didn't match, it could very well be that the reason why they belong to a completely different haplogroup or have a completely different genetic signature is because the origin of their particular surname is completely different from the origin of the Spearin surname. And this is one of the great advantages of Y DNA testing. It can help you ascertain whether a particular surname is of single origin or of multi-origin. And as more Spearins and Sperrings and Spearins join this project, we should be able to ascertain whether there is a single or a multiple origin for the Spearing surname. Now, interestingly, the people in genetic family 1, the larger group, all belong to haplogroup I2b1. And here is a map of the frequency of distribution of this haplogroup within Europe. And you'll see that there's a large concentration of this particular haplogroup in northern Germany, very close to where Flanders would have been historically. And this is certainly consistent with the idea that the Spearins originated in the Low Countries. It doesn't confirm it by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly is consistent, and it's a very interesting piece of circumstantial evidence. Now, here is a summary, a simplified diagram of my family tree, the Spearn family tree, and along the left-hand side you have the timeline, and each of these individual families above the green line all represent members of genetic family 1, all of whom are haplogroup I2b1. This member here from genetic family 2 has a completely different genetic signature. So these are the families as we have been able to define them on the basis of documentary research, and we've gone back as far as about 1800 in the majority of these families. So, and this is represented by the red box at the top of each of the families, and that is the most distant known ancestor. Then a little bit further back we have the early Limerick Spearns, and before that the London Sperrings, and then before that the Cambridge Spearings. So this is a very simplified diagram of the family tree. And the people with the blue borders are those members or representatives of each family who have undertaken the Y-DNA test. And what the test has actually told us is that it's helped confirm the theory. We are all definitely related, at least those of us in genetic family 1. And furthermore, we probably share a common ancestor within the last 300 to 400 years. And this genetic evidence is very much in keeping with the documentary evidence that we're probably related to these early Limerick Spearns. The fact that some families have the unusual combination Hartwell-Spearn means that they are probably related directly to these early Limerick Spearns, but because all of the families in genetic family 1 are related to each other, we can all piggyback onto the Hartwell-Spearn families and jump across the divide of the 1700s back to the early 1700s with them. Of course, we still need to find some documentary evidence to fill in the missing 2 to 3 generations between these early Limerick Spearns and the most distant known ancestors of each of the families in genetic family 1. And we need to bolster the connection between the London Spearings and the early Limerick Spearns. So to do this, it would be great if we found a direct male line descendant of the London Spearings and tested him and see whether he matched people in genetic family 1. We also need to further explore the connection between the Cambridge Spearings and the London Spearings, and again it would be nice to have a direct male line descendant of the Cambridge Spearings, have him tested and see if he matched genetic family 1 also. We might also be related to other English and European Spearings, and this remains to be ascertained by further testing. So for the future, we would like to test all 236 branches of the Spearn family tree. We'd also need, at some point in time, to build a mutation history tree. And as the science of Y-DNA testing advances, it should be possible to lump together families that are more closely related because they share the same mutations, and also identify families that are least related to each other on the basis of their mutation profile. We also need to document each tree. DNA is not the end of the story, it's the middle of the story, and we still have a lot of work to do doing further documentary research and documenting each of the trees. And of course we need to test more English and European Spearings to ascertain whether there is a single origin for the surname Spearing or whether there is a multiple origin. So that's the first type of DNA test, the Y-DNA test. The second type is the mitochondrial DNA, and that goes back along the direct female line. And to illustrate its application, I'd like to talk to you about the king in the car park. And this, of course, is Richard III, the Hunchback King. And he died at the Battle of Bosworth in about 1485 and is buried in the Church of the Grey Friars. So says a slab of concrete on the floor of Leicester Cathedral. Now, Philippa Langley spearheaded the Richard III Society into raising money to find the location of Grey Friars and to try and locate the body so that this particular king could be given the royal burial that a lot of people feel that he so richly deserves. So they looked at old maps of Leicester and found Grey Friars on old maps, related it to current maps, and discovered that the ruins of Grey Friars were probably buried underneath the car park of Leicester Social Services, as a result of which they managed to get an archaeological team in to start digging, and on the first day of the dig they discovered some bones. Okay, they did some further excavation and found that there was a large curvature in the spine of the particular skeleton that they found. This was very tantalizing discovery. Could this possibly be the body of Richard III? It seemed highly incredible that such a find would be made on the very first day of the excavation. Some further excavations revealed that the bones were actually buried between the choir and the presbytery of what would have been Grey Friars Abbey, and this is exactly where you expect people of importance to be buried. An examination of the skull showed that this person had been through the wars. There was a large hole in the top of the skull, as if somebody had shoved a sharp object down through it. Part of the skull had been chipped off, as if it had been swiped at by a sword, and there was a large hole in the base of the skull, which could have been made by a pike being thrust into the person's head. There was even evidence of humiliation wounds in the pelvis, where it looked like somebody had forced a sword into the backside of this particular unfortunate individual as they lay across a horse, for example. Carbon dating of the remains suggested that this person had died certainly within the time frame of the death of Richard III, and when we did DNA testing on a distant relative of Richard III, and here we see Michael Ibsen taking the DNA test with Dr. Tory King from the University of Leicester in the background, Michael was an exact match for the mitochondrial DNA found in the teeth of the skeleton. So all of this evidence taken together, along with the facial reconstruction based on the skull, pointed to the fact that this probably, on the balance of probabilities, was Richard III. So much so, in fact, that the bones are going to be reburied in a royal ceremony in Leicester Cathedral. Oh no, you're not. Oh yes, we are. Oh no, you're not. War of the Roses Part 2. So there's going to be a huge amount of discussion about whether it is or is not appropriate to bury the bones in Leicester Cathedral in a royal ceremony. But here is the direct female line, the mitochondrial DNA line of Richard III, and you'll see that Richard's mother, here's Richard here, and his mother was Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, and she had a daughter, Anne, who passed her mitochondrial DNA down to her daughter Anne, and down to her daughter Catherine, Barbara, Margaret, Barbara, 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 Anne, thank goodness, Charlotte, Charlotte, Muriel, Joy, and then down to Michael Ibsen today. And the important thing is that a match on the DNA test is only one piece of evidence, and it's the totality of the evidence that suggests, on the balance of probabilities, that this is Richard III. So that's the mitochondrial DNA test being applied to a real-life situation. The final type of DNA test is the autosomal DNA test, and this has a reach of about 7 generations, or about 210 years or so, if you allow 30 years per generation. And to give you an example from my own family tree, which is, here we see it again, I've done the autosomal DNA test, and that allows me a reach of about 210 years back from my date of birth, and that brings me back to my 4 times great-grandparents, roughly around about 1765. But of course, I've got my dad to do the test, so that brings us back an extra generation to my 5 times great-grandparents, and I've got my maternal aunt to do the test as well. So that brings us back to about 1730 or so, by which I mean that it is possible to test, to find people who might be related to us via a common ancestor who lived around about 1730. And if you just do a fishing trip with autosomal DNA, this is the sort of result that you might get. And this is from my matches page, and you see that there are a variety of different suggested relationships here: third cousin, third, fourth, fourth, and then plenty of fifth cousins, etc., etc. So how does one approach analysis of your autosomal DNA matches? Well, the first step is to see if the common ancestor is obvious. And in order to do this, one should look at the list of ancestors that many of the participants have actually posted on the website. And in this particular case, Simpson stands out because I have a Simpson in my family tree. So if I was to contact this individual, I would say, hello, it looks like we're genetic cousins based on the autosomal DNA test. I see that you have a Simpson among your ancestors. Well, I have one too. Would you like to share family trees and see if we can find a common ancestor? So that would be in that sort of situation. Now, some people have actually posted family trees, and you see them here in the kind of blue squares, and you can click on this and you can actually view the family trees of these people and the various ancestors that they have. But the first step the second step would be to actually start with your closest match. In my case, it's a third cousin, and to contact them and ask them to collaborate and share their family trees. And here is a family tree that I received from one of my recent matches, and it's a bow tie chart. The paternal ancestors are on the left hand side, the maternal ancestors are on the right hand side, and step 3 would be to identify highly unlikely ancestral lines in both of your trees. And there's various ways that you can do this. For example, if there is a match on the X chromosome, there is only certain ancestral lines down which the X chromosome can be passed. So one can eliminate all of those ancestral lines down which it would be impossible for that X chromosome to pass. The second way would be to maybe determine whether the match was on your maternal side or your paternal side. So for example, if you have had cousins tested or father or mother tested, then it would be possible to determine whether there was a match on the maternal side or the paternal side, and that would be very helpful. In fact, it would eliminate 50% of your ancestors as potential candidates for the common ancestor. One can also look at ethnicity, nationality. For example, if there's no Chinese in your family, but there's Chinese in your match's family, then you can say, well, it's probably not that line. The step 4 would be to identify your in common with matches. Now, these are matches that the two of you share in common with each other. And the theory here is that if all of these matches share the same DNA segment, then they must have inherited it from the same common ancestor. And the way I like to visualize this is if you find people who match your in common with matches and put them around a table, almost as if they were playing cards, and get them to repeat the process that you've gone through initially with your first match. Identify highly unlikely ancestral lines, ask them to eliminate people who don't match on the X if that's a particular if they do match on the X, then you can eliminate non-X lines. Let's go through the same process, and in this way develop a shortlist of the potential candidates for the common ancestor. And when you have your shortlist shortlisted, you can compare your hands, throw down your cards, and see if you can identify the common ancestor that way. Now, the common ancestor may be beyond the bounds of documentary research. They may be beyond the reach of documentary research, but this methodology would hopefully be able to identify the common surname of the common ancestor, because hopefully some of your common matches will have at least a couple of generations of males up to the common ancestor, and of course along that direct male line you would also have the common surname. So hopefully 1, 2 or even 3 of your matches among the 15 or so around the table would actually have the common surname among their shortlist. So that's how you would approach a fishing trip with autosomal DNA. But of course, autosomal DNA can be used to answer a specific question. And to illustrate this particular application of the autosomal DNA test, I'd like to talk to you about the mystery of the wedding memento. Now, several years ago, my dad was going through his grandfather's paper, and a wedding memento fell out for David Patterson and Ruby Kathleen Gleason, and they were married at Targominda on the 23rd of March in 1893. Well, I looked for Targominda on Google, and I found that it's right in the middle of the Australian desert, surrounded by man-eating koalas, sharks with frickin' lasers, giant rats, scorpions, and Danny Minogue. So the obvious question was, what the heck was a wedding memento from the middle of the Australian desert doing in my father's grandfather's papers? Well, always one to accept a challenge, I tried to trace Ruby Kathleen Gleason and find out what her story was. And I managed to get hold of her marriage certificate and also her death certificate, and lo and behold, her parents were John Gleason and Anne Gleason. Well, I thought fantastic, because my great-great-grandparents were John Gleason and Anne Gleason. And surely there can't be that many John Gleasons? Well, actually, Anne Gleason had a brother called John Gleason, and they had a sister called Catherine Gleason, who married a John Gleason. So there were 3 John Gleasons in the same family, so it's certainly not beyond the bounds of possibility that there was another John Gleason married to an Anne Gleason in the same locality at that same time. But I looked at other pieces of information, and Ruby Kathleen was born in Longstone, and lo and behold, the children of my John and Anne Gleason were born either in Longstone or in the neighbouring townlands of Tralee or Killascully. Ruby Kathleen's father listed his profession as hotel keeper on her marriage certificate, and I thought no, because my John Gleason was a labourer, but on her death certificate she said he was a farmer, so maybe she was telling a porky pie about her father's profession on her marriage certificate. She was born around about 1870 or so, and this was certainly in keeping with some of the early children of my John and Anne Gleason: Catherine, born in 1868, Bridget in 1872, and Winifred in 1877. And apparently, Ruby Kathleen went to Australia in 1886, which kind of ties in with the death of my John Gleason in 1885. We also had a family lore on our side that Timothy and Winifred went to Australia, and Winifred had a daughter who was a concert pianist or a singer or some such. Well, there were some tantalizing parallels between the documentary evidence available for both families, but there wasn't enough to be really confident that we could say that our John and Anne Gleason were the same people as their John and Anne Gleason. So I was able to trace the family of Ruby Kathleen Gleason, and I found her grandson, and he was in his 80s, and we struck an email communication, and he was able to tell me that she came to Sydney with her uncle and aunt. She had a brother who went to the US and became very good at baseball, and she had a daughter who was an accomplished musician and excelled at violin. A very interesting parallel between their family lore and our family lore. So we decided that the best way to resolve the issue was to actually get Alan to have a DNA test done, and I sent him the kit. He scraped his cheek, and 8 weeks later his autosomal DNA came in through the post. Now, if the 2 John and Anne Gleasons are in fact the same couple, then that would mean that Martin and Ruby Kathleen were in fact brother and sister. They were siblings, and they should share about 50% of their DNA in common. My dad and Alan, on the other hand, would have been second cousins, and they would have shared just over 3% of their DNA in common, and myself and Alan would have been second cousins once removed, and we would have shared about 1.5% of our DNA in common. And that, of course, is the average amount of DNA. There is a percentage range, 95% confidence interval around these estimates, and you can see that the range is here. So the results came through for Alan, and they showed that he shared 2.4% of his DNA in common with my dad, and that's well within the range that one would expect for a relationship of second cousins. I did my DNA comparison, and I shared 1.4% of my DNA in common with Alan, again well within the range one would expect for second cousins once removed. So what has the DNA actually told us? Well, we are definitely genetically related, and the best fit, according to the DNA, is second cousins, and this is completely consistent with the documentary evidence, so the two of them are very, very complementary. And it means that on the balance of probabilities, our John and Anne Leeson are probably the same couple as their John and Anne Leeson, and Martin and Ruby Kathleen are probably siblings, brother and sister. There are many unanswered questions. For example, where the heck did the name Ruby Kathleen come from? Was it one of the sisters that Martin had, Catherine, Bridget, Winifred, or is it a sibling that we've never identified previously? How did she get to Australia? Why did she end up in the middle of the Australian desert? All very tantalizing questions that further documentary research will hopefully address. Now, those are the three types of DNA tests, the Y, the mitochondrial, and the autosomal, but of course DNA testing has its limitations. It's not a substitute for documentary research, it's just an extra tool that you can add to your toolkit. Cost is an issue as well, because the cost of doing these tests is not inconsequential. Both the Y and the mitochondrial DNA test cost around about $150, and the autosomal DNA test costs around about $290. A lot of people complain that they have difficulty understanding the results, and the way that the results are communicated is far too technical and too difficult for them to understand. So this really represents a major challenge to the genetic genealogy community to try and communicate the meaning of these results in a way that is meaningful and understandable by the average person. Privacy and data protection are also issues, and there may be legal implications to doing a DNA test, so one has to be careful. Non-paternity events, adoptions, illegitimacies, what do you do if you find these in your family line? These are the sort of issues you may have to deal with. As far as the matches are concerned, they largely come from the US, which is great news for people doing Irish family history research, because of course so many of our Irish ancestors left from Ireland during and after the famine for the US, and the fact that so many of the people who have tested so far are of US origin means good news for us. In fact, 70% of the databases are US, and 30% of the database is non-US for family tree DNA, for example. Another limitation is which company do you test with? And the fact that the different companies don't talk to each other, they don't share the databases with each other. So just because you test with one company doesn't mean you'll be able to compare yourself with the results of another. But there are various ways around this, and there are public databases available such as YSearch, MitoSearch, and GEDmatch, but these are not used frequently enough, and there's been some recent trouble with these websites as a result of data mining. But there are three companies that do DNA testing: Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, and AncestryDNA. And Family Tree DNA is the only company that currently does Y-DNA STR testing. There are two types of DNA marker. One is the STR marker, the short tandem repeat. The second one is the SNP marker, or the SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism. You don't really need to know about the technicalities, but the STR test, the Y-DNA STR test, is currently the industry standard for those people who are interested in studying surnames or doing one-name studies. And also Family Tree DNA has the best setup for these type of projects. They've got a great support system for doing this type of DNA research. And they also have the largest genealogical database. However, 23andMe are primarily interested in doing medical risk assessment, but they do also do genealogical research as well. And they've got a very good deal for $99, which gives you autosomal Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA. 23andMe also do genealogical research, but they focus primarily on medical risk assessment. At least that's where most of the people, that's why most of the people in their database have done the test with 23andMe. But about 20% or so of the database is also interested in genealogy. And they offer a very good deal for $99 because you get an autosomal DNA test, a Y-DNA test, and a mitochondrial DNA test, as well as the medical risk assessment. On top of that, you have to add $89 for postage to Ireland and $79 for uploading your results to FamilyTreeDNA in order to compare with the FamilyTreeDNA database. But it is very good value, and if you're more interested in a fishing trip and using autosomal DNA, then it would make sense to test with 23andMe and upload your results to FamilyTreeDNA so that you have the value of comparing with both databases. Also, the autosomal test with 23andMe appears to be the best for ethnic admixture. Not particularly of interest to most Irish people, but can be very, very useful for people living in America who may come from a variety of different ethnic backgrounds. The third major company that does DNA testing is AncestryDNA, and they only do autosomal DNA testing now. They had done Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA testing previously, but they don't offer that service anymore. The interesting thing about AncestryDNA is that they link the DNA results to trees on Ancestry, and because Ancestry is so popular for putting and uploading your family tree, it means that people like the adoption community in the US have had great success in using the AncestryDNA test with the Ancestry family trees, and in that way a lot of adoptees in the US have connected with their biological families. The problem from an Irish point of view, of course, is that this particular test is only available in the US currently, and there are no plans at the moment to release it to Europe. There's very, very useful testing comparison charts on the ISOG website, which looks at the different companies and the different tests that they offer. Now, ISOG stands for the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, and this is a group of people who have done DNA tests in the past and have just got together to advocate and educate about the use of genetics as a tool for genealogical research. And ISOG is a fantastic organization. They provide a lot of support for new people who haven't a clue about DNA, and if you're a project administrator and actually want to run your own project, then ISOG provides you with a lot of support in the form of a forum and a discussion group. Also, ISOG are at the forefront of citizen science, and they are playing a major role in liaising with academia in order to further discoveries in terms of genetic genealogy, and that also applies to Irish genetic genealogy research, which I'll talk about shortly. The future of genetic genealogy is bright. We are entering a new era of citizen science, and already academia and ordinary citizens running projects on websites like FamilyTreeDNA are producing incredible findings and publishing their results in scientific journals. The future also looks bright for adoptees, and the Adoption DNA group in the US are having incredible success linking up adoptees with their biological families. Like I mentioned when I discussed the Spearin surname project, it will be possible within the next couple of years to develop mutation history trees which can be overlaid onto traditional family trees and will be able to tell us which branches of a family are more closely related to each other and which ones are more further apart. There's some great work going on, including in Ireland, about ancient migrations, and we'll look at that briefly. And then I want to talk about a particular project that I've started recently, which aims at breaking down historical brick walls. Now, in terms of ongoing academic research in Ireland, Professor Dan Bradley and his group at Trinity have produced some wonderful research over the last 10 years or so, and they were the first ones to talk about Niall of the Nine Hostages, and how that links in with the Atlantic and the West Atlantic modal haplotypes. And this research very nicely complements that is currently ongoing by the National Genographic Project that is looking at worldwide population movement and migrations. And they recently came out with an updated Geno2 test, which tests much more markers, genetic markers, than has previously been possible to do. So the results of this research will certainly help us understand ancient migrations out of Africa into Europe and specifically into Ireland. Also, the Irish DNA Atlas, which is being spearheaded by Dr. Giampiero Cavalieri of the Royal College of Surgeons in collaboration with the University of Leicester, the same group that analysed the DNA of Richard III, they're trying to map the DNA of the Irish population by recruiting people who have 8 great-grandparents born within a 30-kilometre radius of each other. So this will hopefully identify a very specific autosomal DNA signature for the Irish population. And I think it'll be fascinating to compare it to the People of the British Isles project, which is doing more or less the same thing in England, Scotland and Wales. To complement all of this research, we have the visionary work of Ireland Reaching Out, which has set up an incredible network of parish administrators all over Ireland to help generate interest in genealogy at a local parish level and to help connect people with the Irish diaspora. And they've recently launched their Irish DNA Roots project, and this too will complement the research that is being done by other academic institutions. Now, in terms of citizen science, there are about 6,000 surname projects on family tree DNA. Many of them are Irish, and many of them link with family societies such as the O'Donoghue Society, the O'Mahony Society, and others are very well written up family projects such as the McCarthy Project, which provides a wonderful amount of background information as well as interpretation of the DNA results. I didn't want to go through all 6,000 surname projects and pick out the Irish ones, so I just went through the O's, and here is a selection of Irish O surname projects, and you can see that there's a variety of people recruited in different studies. Some of them, for example, the O'Rourke's have 7, whereas the O'Briens have 278. So these are surname projects at different stages of maturity, and the next 5 to 10 years will see an incredible amount of evidence being produced that will tell us about these particular surnames and their origins. Not only do we have surname projects, but we also have a lot of Irish geographical projects ongoing. So, for example, we have the Ireland Y DNA project, which is over 5,000 members, and this is being administered by Margaret Jordan and Paul Duffy. We have the Ireland Mitochondrial DNA project, which is over 1,000 members, and this is being administered by Catherine Borge, the president of the International Society of Genetic Genealogy. And then we have a variety of other geographical projects, such as the Munster Irish, being administered by Nigel McCarthy, Finbar O'Mahony and Elizabeth O'Donovan Ross, and a variety of other geographical projects which are being complemented by specific haplogroup projects such as the RM222 project, which probably represents the Dál Riada ancient clan from which Niall of the Nine Hostages is thought to have originated. And then we have the Leinster Modal project and a Dalcassian Sept project as well. In the next 5 to 10 years, it may very well be possible to identify unique genetic signatures for some of the ancient Irish clans, and that would be a fascinating discovery. The last type of project is one that breaks down historical brick walls, and this is one that I set up recently. And it's based on the fact that back in the 1600s, many Irish people went off to the Caribbean and to the new American colonies like Virginia and Maryland. And some of them were exiles who fled the country. Some of them were soldiers who were captured and sold as slaves. And others sold themselves into indentured servitude for a period of 7 years. But in actual fact, many of them never saw the end of those 7 years because they ended up working in conditions very similar to slavery and were worked to death. But between 1652 and 1657, after the Cromwellian conquest, tens of thousands of Irish men, women and children were herded down to Cork, shipped across to Bristol, and then across the Atlantic to the new American colonies and the West Indies, in particular Barbados. Now, estimates of the number of people involved vary from about 50,000 to 130,000, and I've even seen 300,000, but 50,000 seems to be a reasonable estimate. Now, this is a drop in the ocean when you compare it to the 12.5 million Africans who were transported across the Atlantic as part of the transatlantic slave trade. But in terms of a percentage of the population, when you consider that after the Cromwellian conquest, the population of Ireland was about 1 million, this would mean that approximately 4 to 15% of the Irish population was sold into slavery. And that is an incredible statistic. And you can read about this in books like God's Executioner, White Cargo, or To Hell or Barbados. And these Irish exiles, the descendants of these Irish exiles, are very much in evidence today, as demonstrated by the plethora of Irish surnames in places like Montserrat, Barbados and Jamaica, and also the fact that Irish culture is still very much celebrated in certain parts of the Caribbean. So, for example, Montserrat is the only country outside of Ireland to celebrate St. Patrick's Day as a public holiday. So, inspired by the visionary work of Ireland Reaching Out, I decided to set up a project called IGRS, and IGRS stands for Irish Caribbean Ancestry Reconnecting through DNA. And the three cornerstones of IGRS are reconnection, reunion, and restoration. And by reconnection, I mean reconnecting with the ancestral homeland and also reconnecting with living descendants. Reunion can involve reuniting with the local community and with genetic cousins, and restoration involves gaining back some of what we lost. So, reconnecting with the ancestral homeland can be a relatively easy thing to do. It may not even require DNA testing, because available resources such as the Irish Times surname database and also the various databases created by Dr. Tyrone Bowes of Irish Origins mean that we can actually locate a surname for our particular, or we can locate a clan homeland for our particular name relatively easily. And Ireland Reaching Out and IGRS could certainly help with this particular process. So, for example, with my name, the Gleeson family name, this is very conveniently located in one single origin, and that is just south of Lough Derg. But for a surname like Carroll or O'Carroll, there may be 4 distinct places where the O'Carroll name may have originated. In this kind of situation, DNA testing can help to pinpoint which of the different O'Carroll locations the particular person is associated with, and that's using a methodology developed by Dr. Tyrone Bowes of Irish Origins. And IGRS could certainly help people use this methodology to ascertain where their clan homeland lies. But in order to reconnect with genetic cousins, this will require DNA testing, and specifically a Y-DNA test from family tree DNA. Now, the idea here is that there has been a common ancestor in the early 1600s in Ireland, and he gave rise to descendants, some of whom were transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, some of whom survived and stayed in Ireland, and both of these distant cousins have inherited not only the surname of the common ancestor, but also the Y-DNA of the common ancestor. So by doing a Y-DNA test and getting a match on that test between two people who share the same surname, and given the known history of the Irish Caribbean and maybe any individual family history from the people involved, it may be possible to conclude that the two distant cousins share a common ancestor in the early 1600s. And in this way, a family that has not seen each other for 400 years can be reunited. IGRS will be responsible for recruitment to the project, helping people interpret the results, helping them find their clan Homeland and also helping them connect with genetic cousins. And it may very well be possible to use the incredible network that has been created by the visionary work of Ireland Reaching Out to help achieve these aims as well. Reunion involves email, telephone calls in the initial period, but just like we did for President Obama, it may mean getting the people back to meet their distant cousins and to reconnect with the local communities. And restoration, to my mind, is an ongoing activity between descendants and local communities to restore some of what they have lost. So, for example, for the individual, and I think this is the most important, for the individuals who actually have tested and have matched each other, it means gaining a sense of belonging, a sense of self, a sense of family, kinship and community. For the local communities involved on both the Caribbean and the Irish side, it means maybe reawakening local knowledge and an interest in local history, remembering the past and honouring the ancestors. And for the wider society, I think it would be great to create a legacy of restoration from what was a legacy of slavery. So, in the final paragraph of his book, To Hell or Barbados, Sean O'Callaghan says, "It is my fervent hope that families in Ireland will band together and do something for their long-forgotten brethren, and I think that time has come. And it won't be long before we wake up in the morning to these type of headlines in our local and national papers." And this to me would be the icing on the cake. This to me would be the proof of the pudding that DNA can be a brick wall buster. Thank you very much for listening.